In this session, we're going to see the difference between what we can call an open source model versus a proprietary model. Now, it's sometimes easy for people to simplify the world we live in by actually saying that we used to be in a world where open source was the rule, especially in the so-called Web 1.0, or when the internet first took over by the mid-90s until the beginning of the 2000s. And then we moved to a proprietary-based software industry that now is controlling the market. In reality, this is only a partial view of how things are, because we know that the reality is a little bit more complex and that it's a much more hybrid and it's much more diverse than we like to think. So it's not just like we have proprietary software that are owned by tech giants that are controlling the market. In reality, many of the software that power up the existing web as we know it today are still open sourced. As an example, a very simple one, take the case of companies like foundations like WordPress or like Wikipedia or like GitHub. I mean, many of those companies who are extremely valuable as of today, they still play an extremely important role in this web economy. So it's very interesting to understand the difference and what makes up an open source model versus a proprietary model, and what's the underlying business model of the two. Now, when it comes to open source, if you're not familiar with it, you might know that open source, it's actually when a software license underlying a software is actually open. It can be reused. It can be freely available to other people and other business people that can use it, of course with attribution, but that can use this license freely. And now the open source model has been managed over the years in various ways, but usually the way it works, like for instance, if you take the case of Wikipedia, you usually have a foundation that manages the open source project underneath it. It can be a software, like in the case of Wikipedia, there is the website, but there is also the software that powers the website, which is managed by a foundation. And in that case, the foundation might survive, for instance, through donations of the users, which is the case of Wikipedia. Let's take now another example of open source project like WordPress and the business model around it. When you look at WordPress instead, the open source WordPress.org is again a freely available platform for publishing content on the internet, which is managed by a non-profit foundation. On the other side, though, WordPress has also built a corporation, which is WordPress.com, actually is Automatic, which is the company that owns various brands like Jetpack, and it runs WordPress.com, which is a sort of hosting company, on top of which you also have a blogging platform which looks a lot like WordPress.org, but it has some additional features, and so they're actually building a subscription business on top of WordPress.org with WordPress.com. So in that case, the model is slightly different from Wikipedia, where with Wikipedia you have a foundation which manages pretty much everything. With WordPress instead, you have a foundation which manages the WordPress.org brand, and instead you have a corporation which manages the .com brand, and the Automatic company, which is the company that controls all the private brands built on top of WordPress, brands like, again, WordPress.com, Jetpack, WooCommerce, and all other tools that there are premium tools built on top of WordPress.com. So on top of the open source, you have a premium software which has been built and which gets offered to users for a price, for a subscription. Another interesting case of an open source is actually GitHub, which has been acquired by Microsoft, and it has been integrated now within the company. But also GitHub previously was operated in two ways. So on the one side you had a non-profit foundation, and then on the other side you had a sort of a corporation which would monetize the software, the enterprise version of the underlying free software, open source software, for an enterprise fee. So for instance, you could publish more projects, you could publish them privately, you could handle more stuff more easily, and that's how this model worked. So those are some of the examples. Again, we saw Wikipedia through the foundation gets donations from users. We saw WordPress, which the WordPress.org is handled by a foundation, while the WordPress.com is handled by a corporation, which is called Automatic. And then we saw the GitHub model, which used open source underlying software, and on top of it an enterprise software, which is constructed as a premium version of the open source. When instead we look at a premium software model, in this case really it's very straightforward. You have a proprietary software underlying the platform, which is sold at premium, and in this case the model is pretty linear, because you have a for-profit organization, a corporation, which exploit all the profits that come from the premium software. So what is the main difference between the two, also in terms of let's say the creation of the software? So on the one side, when it comes to open source, it's very important to remark that part of the open source project especially initially, it's developed by a community of developers and by a core development team. So when this gets released on the market, it cannot be monetized by a single corporation. Instead, it needs to be managed by a foundation in the interest of the development community. So this is very important. When instead you have a proprietary model which has been developed in-house by a company which invested its own money and money from investors to actually develop this software and this platform, the software can be monetized as the company likes. So there is no limitations there, and the company can actually build up again an organization, a corporation that takes up all the profits from the proprietary free software. And those are the main difference between open source and the proprietary software technologies, how they've been used, and what are the business models developed on top of them.